Hello, I watched The Matrix Resurrections twice. I have mixed feelings about this movie. While it was wonderful to see Neo and Trinity again, it seemed as though it was actually two movies. One, a reflection upon life, especially life in Hollywood, what it takes to make a movie these days, and so on. And the second was an action flick. In contrast, nearly every action scene in the first Matrix movie was also a philosophical exploration on the nature of reality. At times, Resurrections waxed philosophical, at times it was all bullets and force fields, but rarely was a scene both. As a result, the movie seemed disconnected and difficult to follow. After watching it a first time, I thought that perhaps I wasn't being fair, so I rewatched all three Matrix movies and then rewatched Matrix Resurrections. Although The Matrix Reloaded and Matrix Revolutions weren't anywhere as good as the original movie, what could be, they weren't as bad as I had thought when I first watched them. By the time I watched Resurrection a second time, I had not only rewatched all the previous movies, but I had also watched several reviews and talked my impressions over with friends, one of whom liked the movie quite a lot. And trying to understand what my friends saw in Resurrections that I didn't, I think I came to understand the movie better. Perhaps one of the flaws of this movie is similar to that of Jupiter Ascending, a movie that Lily and Lana wrote and directed. They developed an incredibly intricate, interesting story, but one that could not be told in 2.5 hours, or at least, not told well. When it comes to Resurrections, I can't focus on everything, so what follows are just a few observations. As nearly all reviewers have said, the first third of this movie is very meta, but that in itself isn't a bad thing. It is rumored that Lana was given an ultimatum by Warner Brothers, the corporation that owns the rights to the franchise, to the effect that either she make a new Matrix movie or they would commission someone else to. So she said yes. But it almost seems as though she wrote her real-life discontent with the ultimatum into the script. In the movie, Thomas Anderson is a successful computer programmer. He created 3 computer games in a series named The Matrix. These games relate the experiences that Neo and Trinity had in the previous Matrix movies. Early in the movie, Neo is called into his boss's office and informed that his company, I'm going to slaughter this, Deux Machina, Deus Machina? Anyway, which is roughly translated as God in the Machine, has received an ultimatum from Warner Brothers to make another program in the Matrix franchise or he will commission someone else to. Since Warner Brothers is the corporation that, in real life, holds the right to the Matrix movies, some feel that this is Lana giving Warner Brothers the middle finger. That seems plausible on its own, but it seems to go against something Lana Wachowski said. This is from Wikipedia. As explained by Lana Wachowski during the Berlin International Literature Festival in 2021, Warner Brothers constantly approached the Wachowskis every year to make another Matrix sequel, but the Wachowskis always declined the offers out of lack of interest and because they felt that the trilogy's story had concluded. However, in 2019, Ron and Lynn Wachowski, the Wachowskis' parents, passed away alongside a close friend of Lana's. After not being able to process that kind of grief, Lana suddenly conceived the story of The Matrix Resurrections one sleepless night. In her words, she felt that while she couldn't have her parents back, she then could have Neo and Trinity back, feeling very comforted to see them alive again. With Lana Wachowski stepping forward for a sequel, Warner Brothers readily accepted her concept, eager to have the franchise's creator aboard for the sequel. Now, of course the question is that what happened? I don't know. Both stories seem plausible. As so often happens, it could be a bit of both. I think that my expectations, high expectations, had a lot to do with my disappointment in this movie the first time I watched it. The first time through, I thought the beginning of the movie was both confusing and slow. The second time, though, I was prepared for the pacing, and that helped me to appreciate Lana's clever humor. The first quarter of the movie is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek reflection on life, the universe, and everything, commenting on the torturous process of making an action movie. That wasn't what I was expecting from the movie when I watched it the first time. I was hoping it would be more like the first Matrix, and consequently was a bit disappointed. Let's talk a bit about the beginning of the movie. At first, it seemed nearly identical to the opening of the original. Police officers rush down a passage towards a room in which a young woman sits with her back to the door. On the way down the hall, one of the officers steps in a puddle, and I realized I was only watching a reflection. I thought this was very cool. It may not have been, but it seemed like a reference to Plato's allegory of the cave. If you haven't heard of this, here is a description. In the allegory, Socrates describes a group of people who have lived chained to the wall of a cave all their lives, facing a blank wall. The people watch shadows projected on the wall from objects passing in front of a fire behind them and give names to those shadows. The shadows are the prisoner's reality. Socrates explains how the philosopher is like a prisoner who is freed from the cave and comes to understand that the shadows on the wall are actually not reality at all. A philosopher aims to understand and perceive the higher levels of reality. However, the other inmates of the cave do not even desire to leave their prison, for they know no better life. So we see here that Plato thought if one of these captive humans were to get loose from their bonds, discover the upper world, and then go back to the people in the cave and tell them what he had seen, that they would not be believed. In this analogy, the philosopher is a bit like the one. Anyway, I thought that the shot of the world reflected in a puddle was a very cool way of encapsulating one of the underlying messages of the movie. It is things like this that make me love The Matrix. In this review, I've said a lot about what bothered me about the movie, but there were also cool ideas introduced. For example, in The City, Io, the successor of Zion, machines and humans live in peace with each other. Also, programs can take on a kind of body in the real world, though the process isn't very well explained. But it was still nice to see new things. It was nice to see the world of the Matrix changing and growing. Okay, enough nice things. Here's another thing that bothered me about the movie. Really, I have to say that a lot of my objections to the movie are quibbles. For example, Trinity's husband, Chad. So Wikipedia tells us that Chad is internet slang for an attractive and confident male. At first, it seems as though we don't have a reason to think Chad is not a good husband and father, but toward the end he seems toxically possessive of Trinity, which isn't cool and does deserve pushback, but it also seems artificial. Trinity's husband has been created for us to dislike him, so I felt that the relationship was artificial. And of course, it was, since Chad and her kids turned out to really just be bots. So they weren't even truly alive. I didn't really understand that part of it. And while I don't object to the end in and of itself, it seemed slightly artificial to me. Yes, okay, Trinity and Neo were always two, a pair rather than 1 + 1. And that is part of the appeal of the series. In the beginning of this review, I mentioned that I thought that many of the flaws in the movie were there because Lana Wachowski had developed a world that was bigger than one story, at least bigger than a story that could be told in the space of one movie. Perhaps, rather than making the story of Resurrections into a movie, it would have been more successful as a TV series. It felt as though there were two movies. One was an action flick, and the other was a thoughtful, slightly jaded reflection on society, which frankly I enjoyed. But that wasn't until after I had talked to friends about the movie, listened to many other reviews, and thought about it for a day. The problem is that I, and perhaps most people, fell in love with the first movie because it was a nearly flawless blend of both philosophy and action. In this movie, much of the first third of the movie has the philosophical bits, and then we have over-the-top violence that doesn't really make a lot of sense, and which did not entertain me. And I like action movies. I love action scenes, but with these, for example, the long fight scene on the train, I looked at my watch and waited for the scene to be over. Speaking of the train sequence, there was something else that bothered me. Not about the scene, but the previous one. Bugs had just prevented Neo from jumping, or walking, off the side of a building. In the scene, Neo had been drinking, and he is standing, bottle in hand, on the roof of the building, about to step off. Right at the moment he begins to step off, Bugs pulls him back. When I first watched the movie, this seemed like convenient timing, but I didn't think too much more about it. Later, though, Bugs tells Neo that she first became aware of the Matrix when she saw Neo stepping off another building, and he didn't fall. So, as far as Bugs knows, if Neo steps off the building, he won't fall, and his wondering about whether he is crazy or sane will be settled. So, why did she stop him? Anyway. Yes, okay, perhaps Neo stepping off the roof would have triggered some sort of fail-safe, and the analyst would have been summoned just as he was summoned when the police rushed in and shot up Neo's workplace. Anyway, that's one example of why this movie drove me nuts in places. In conclusion, even with its flaws, The Matrix is a watchable movie. I'm reminded of Roger Ebert's admonition not to let a negative review stop people from watching a movie. In the end, perhaps my biggest complaint is that I felt this movie in places looked down its nose at action movies, and those who like to go see them, such as myself. I suspect that's one reason why some of the action scenes were horrible. It is very difficult to do well what you despise. Action divorced from reason is silly. Similarly, philosophy divorced from reality is pointless, boring, and ultimately, that's what this movie was. I hope you got something from this review. If you would like me to do more reviews, please like and subscribe. And do tell me what you think of my review. If you agree with me, if you disagree with me, thank you. I'll talk to you later.